George Whitman woke up to the sound of jeepneys rumbling past and vendors shouting their morning wares. His back ached from sleeping on cardboard spread over concrete. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the early hour. The humidity in Manila was relentless, even at 6 in the morning. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting, and looked around at the street corner that had been his home for the past 3 weeks. Roxas Boulevard stretched before him, the Manila Bay seawall just across the street. Other homeless people were stirring around him. Filipino men mostly, some missing teeth, some missing limbs, all sharing this small patch of pavement under the overhang of a closed shop. They'd become George's unlikely community. They didn't speak much English, and he didn't speak Tagalog, but they shared food when they had it, protected each other's meager belongings, warned each other when police were doing sweeps. George was 69 years old, a British citizen, a former postal worker who'd saved diligently for 47 years. He'd retired with £190,000 in savings and a pension that paid him £800 a month. He'd come to the Philippines 8 months ago with dreams of a peaceful retirement near the ocean, a simple life, good weather, friendly people. Now, he was sleeping rough on the streets of Manila with about 300 pesos to his name, roughly £4.50, and no way to get home. His passport was gone, stolen. His money was gone, spent or transferred or simply vanished. His visa had expired weeks ago, making him an illegal overstayer subject to arrest and deportation if caught. His apartment was locked, his belongings confiscated by a landlord he owed 3 months' rent. He had no phone, no laptop, no way to contact anyone. How had it come to this? The answer was simple and devastating. Rowena Cruz, Weena, as she'd asked him to call her, a 38-year-old street food vendor who'd befriended him 5 months ago, who'd cooked for him, cleaned his apartment, called him Papa George, and made him feel like he had family again, who'd cried about her sick son, her injured brother, her struggling sister, who'd needed help with hospital bills, school fees, rent payments, medicine, food, electricity, on and on and on. George had helped. Of course he'd helped. What kind of man would he be if he didn't help someone in need? Someone who cared about him? Someone who'd become like a daughter to him? But Weena hadn't been a daughter. She'd been a predator. And George had been easy prey, a lonely old man with money and no family, living alone in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language or understand the culture. She'd taken everything, not through force or violence, but through tears and stories and guilt and the careful manipulation of a man who just wanted to feel useful, who wanted to feel needed, who wanted to believe someone cared about him. George looked down at his hands dirty, calloused from sleeping rough, thin from not eating enough. He barely recognized himself anymore. The George Whitman who'd boarded a plane in Bristol 8 months ago with excitement and hope was gone. In his place was this broken old man sitting on a Manila street corner, wondering if he'd ever see England again. This is the story of how he got here, how paradise turned into hell, how kindness turned into exploitation, how £150,000 disappeared in 5 months, and how a British pensioner ended up homeless on the streets of a foreign city with nowhere to turn. If you've been enjoying the stories I create, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. George Whitman had worked for Royal Mail for 47 years. He'd started as a postman when he was 18, walking the same routes in Bristol every day, delivering letters and parcels regardless of weather. Rain, snow, wind, it didn't matter. The mail had to go through. Over the years, he'd moved up to sorting manager, spending his days coordinating delivery schedules and managing teams of younger postmen. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest and steady. George had never made much money, but he'd been careful. He'd lived in the same small terraced house in Easton for 40 years. He'd driven the same car for 15 years. He'd rarely taken holidays. Every month, he'd put money into savings. Not much, sometimes just £50. Sometimes 100, but over 47 years, it added up. George had never married. He'd had relationships over the years, but nothing that lasted. Work had been his life, his routine. Wake at 5, work by 6, home by 4, dinner, television, bed by 9. Repeat. For decades, his social circle was small. A few mates from work who he'd have a pint with occasionally. His sister Margaret who lived in Wales and he'd see at Christmas. That was about it. George was a quiet man who kept to himself. He wasn't unhappy, exactly. Just existing. When he turned 65, Royal Mail offered him early retirement with a decent package. He'd accumulated enough years for a full pension, £800 a month, and he had £190,000 in savings. Combined, it was enough to live on comfortably in Bristol, if he was careful. But George didn't want to stay in Bristol. After 47 years of the same routine, the same streets, the same gray skies and rain, he wanted something different. He'd spent his life working and saving. Now, he wanted to actually live. He started researching retirement destinations abroad. At first, he looked at Spain, popular with British retirees. Warm weather, still in Europe. But the cost of living was higher than he'd hoped. Portugal was similar, too expensive for his budget. Then a mate from work, Terry, who'd retired 2 years earlier, sent him photos from the Philippines. Beautiful beaches, smiling locals, cheap food. Terry said he was living like a king on his pension. Renting a nice apartment for £300 a month, eating out every day for pocket change. The weather was always warm. The people were friendly and spoke English. "You should come visit," Terry had said. "See for yourself. This place is paradise, mate." George started doing research. The Philippines was a former American colony, which meant English was widely spoken, one of the official languages, in fact. The cost of living was incredibly low. Food, rent, transportation, everything was a fraction of UK prices. The weather was tropical year-round, and there were large expat communities in cities like Manila, Cebu, and Davao, where British retirees lived comfortably. The more George read, the more appealing it became. What was keeping him in Bristol? The weather was miserable. His house was old and needed constant repairs. He had no family there, except Margaret, and they barely spoke anyway. His workmates were busy with their own families. He was utterly alone. In the Philippines, his savings would go 3 or 4 times further. His pension would cover a nice apartment, food, entertainment, everything. He could live near the beach, make new friends, actually enjoy his retirement, instead of just sitting in his house watching television until he died. In October, George sold his house in Easton for £125,000. Combined with his existing savings, he had £190,000 total. It was more money than he'd ever had in one place, more than enough to retire comfortably. He booked a one-way ticket to Manila for early December. He'd stay in a hotel for the first week, then find an apartment to rent long-term. Terry had offered to help him get settled, show him around, introduce him to other expats. George's sister Margaret thought he was mad. "You're 69 years old, George. You don't speak the language. You've never even been to Asia. What if something goes wrong?" "Then I'll deal with it," George said. "I've spent my whole life playing it safe. I want to try something different. But the Philippines, I've heard it's dangerous. Scams, crime." "Every place has crime, Margaret. I'll be careful. I'm not an idiot." But George was naive in ways he didn't realize. He'd lived his entire life in Bristol. He'd never traveled abroad except for one package holiday to Spain in the 1980s. He didn't understand the dynamics of developing countries, didn't understand how desperation could make people see foreigners not as friends but as walking ATMs, didn't understand that his kindness could be weaponized against him. On December 5th, George Whitman boarded a plane at Bristol Airport with 2 suitcases, £190,000 converted to US dollars in his bank account, and dreams of a peaceful life by the ocean. He had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. The flight from Bristol to Manila took 22 hours with layovers in Amsterdam and Singapore. By the time George landed at Ninoy Aquino International Airport, he was exhausted, disoriented, and overwhelmed. The airport was chaos, crowds of people pushing past each other, announcements in Tagalog and English blaring from speakers, the thick, humid air hitting him like a wall when he walked out into the arrival area. He collected his luggage and made his way through customs, then emerged into a sea of taxi drivers and hotel touts, all shouting for his attention. "Sir! Sir! Taxi! Good price! Where are you going?" George felt his heart racing. This was nothing like Bristol, nothing like the orderly queues and polite interactions he was used to. This was overwhelming sensory chaos. He found an official airport taxi and gave the driver the name of his hotel, a mid-range place in Ermita that Terry had recommended. The drive into Manila was unlike anything George had ever experienced. Traffic was insane. Jeepneys, colorful, converted military vehicles packed with passengers wove between cars. Motorcycles carried entire families, children sandwiched between parents with no helmets. Street vendors walked between lanes selling water, cigarettes, newspapers. The honking was constant. The heat was oppressive. George stared out the window, trying to process everything. Towering malls next to shanty towns, luxury cars next to tricycles, beggars at intersections next to businessmen in suits. The contrast was jarring. His hotel in Ermita was basic, but clean. A small room with a bed, air conditioning, and a bathroom. It cost $35 a night, about 27 pounds. The area was busy and slightly run down, but Terry had said it was central and safe enough for tourists. George unpacked, showered, and collapsed onto the bed. He slept for 14 hours straight, his body trying to adjust to the 8-hour time difference. When he woke the next morning, Terry came to meet him. Terry was in his early 70s, tanned and relaxed, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. He looked a decade younger than when George had last seen him in Bristol. "George, mate, welcome to paradise," Terry greeted him with a big grin. They spent the day walking around Manila. Terry showed him the basics, where to exchange money, how to use jeepneys and taxis, which areas to avoid at night, where to find decent restaurants. Manila was overwhelming but also exciting. So much life. So much energy. So different from the quiet, orderly streets of Bristol. "You'll love it here," Terry said over lunch at a seafood restaurant where they ate grilled fish and rice for less than 3 pounds. "The people are friendly. Everything's cheap. The weather's always warm. Best decision I ever made, moving here." Over the next week, Terry helped George find an apartment to rent. They looked at several options in different neighborhoods before settling on a 1-bedroom flat in Ermita, not far from George's hotel. It was on the 3rd floor of an older building, simply furnished but decent. 1 bedroom, a small living area, a kitchen, and a bathroom. The rent was 12,000 pesos a month, about 190 pounds. Utilities extra. George signed a 6-month contract and paid 3 months in advance, 36,000 pesos, about 570 pounds. The landlady, a stern Filipino woman named Mrs. Santos, made it clear she expected payment on time and no trouble. George moved in at the end of December. He bought basic supplies, dishes, a rice cooker, cleaning products, and settled into his new home. From his window, he could see the busy street below, street vendors setting up their carts, children playing, jeepneys rumbling past. It was noisy and chaotic, but it was his. For the first few weeks, George explored Manila with Terry as his guide. They visited Intramuros, the historic walled city. They walked along Manila Bay at sunset. They ate at local restaurants where George tried Filipino food adobo, sinigang, lechon. Some he liked. Some were too strange for his British palate. Terry introduced George to other British expats at a pub in Malate, a group of retired men who met weekly to drink cheap beer and complain about the weather back home. George felt welcome. These were men like him, working-class British pensioners, who discovered they could live better in the Philippines than in the UK. But George also noticed something that made him uncomfortable. Many of these men had young Filipino girlfriends or wives. Women in their 20s and 30s, with men in their 60s and 70s. The dynamic was obvious. The men had money. The women wanted security. It felt transactional, not something George wanted for himself. "I'm not here for that," George told Terry one evening when Terry suggested he visit some of the bars where working girls operated. "Fair enough, mate. But don't judge. Some of these lads are actually happy. Found companionship. It's not all bad." George didn't judge. But he also didn't want to be one of those men buying affection. He wanted something real, or nothing at all. For the first 2 months, George's retirement in Manila was exactly what he'd hoped for. Simple, peaceful, affordable. He'd wake up late, have coffee on his small balcony, walk to the market to buy fresh fruit and vegetables, come home and read or watch television. In the evenings, he'd go to local restaurants or meet Terry and the other expats for drinks. His savings remained untouched. He was living comfortably on his pension alone, 800 pounds a month, about 50,000 pesos. More than enough for rent, food, entertainment, everything. Life was good. Until he met Rowena. George first saw Rowena cruise on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. She was selling snacks from a small cart on the street corner near his apartment. Banana Q fried banana on a stick with caramelized sugar. Fish balls, hard-boiled eggs, cigarettes, small bottles of water and soft drinks. She was a small woman, probably in her late 30s, with a friendly face and a quick smile. She wore simple clothes, jean shorts, and a faded t-shirt, and her cart was basic but clean. Unlike some of the other vendors who shouted at passersby, she waited quietly for customers to approach. George had walked past her cart dozens of times without stopping. But that Tuesday, he was hungry and decided to try the banana queue everyone seemed to be eating. "How much?" he asked, pointing at the fried bananas. 20 pesos, sir," she said with a smile. Her English was decent. George handed her a 50-peso note. She gave him change and a banana queue wrapped in paper. "Thank you, sir." "You are foreigner?" "British," George said. "From England." "Ah, English. Welcome to Philippines. You live here or tourist?" "I live here. Retired." "Very nice. You like Philippines?" "Yes, very much." They chatted for a few minutes. Her name was Rowena, but she said everyone called her Weena. She'd been selling snacks on this corner for 3 years. She supported her family with the income, her son, her mother, her younger siblings. Times were hard, but she was grateful for what she had. George finished his banana queue and went home. It was a pleasant interaction, nothing more. But over the next few weeks, he started stopping at Wena's cart regularly. Sometimes for a snack, sometimes just for a bottle of water. They'd chat for a few minutes each time. She was friendly and curious about his life in England. He enjoyed having someone to talk to who seemed genuinely interested. One day, Wena asked him, "Papa George, you cook for yourself? Or you eat in restaurant?" "Mostly restaurants," George admitted. "I'm not much of a cook. That is expensive. Everyday restaurant? You spend so much money." "It's still cheap compared to England." Weena looked thoughtful. "If you want, I can cook for you. Filipino food. I make for you. You pay just for the food, not for restaurant. Save you money, and I get extra income." George hesitated. It seemed odd. But Weena explained that many Filipinos did this home-cooked meal sold to neighbors or workers. It was common. Cheaper than restaurants. Better quality. "How much would you charge?" George asked. "I cook dinner, bring to your apartment. Good Filipino meal. 150 pesos. Very cheap. Restaurant is 300, 400 pesos. 150 pesos was about £2.30. It did seem reasonable. "Okay," George said. "Let's try it." That evening, Weena arrived at George's apartment with a plastic container filled with chicken adobo, rice, and stir-fried vegetables. She'd cooked it at her home and carried it over. The food was delicious, better than most restaurants George had tried. "This is wonderful," George said. "Thank you, Weena." She beamed with pride. "I am happy you like it. I can cook for you every day if you want. Different dishes, whatever you like." And so began a routine. Every evening, Weena would arrive around 6 with dinner. George would pay her 150 pesos. They'd chat while he ate about his day, about her day, about life in the Philippines, about life in England. She was easy to talk to. She laughed at his jokes. She seemed genuinely interested in him as a person. After a few weeks, Weena offered to clean George's apartment as well. "I see your place is messy, Papa George. I can clean for you, wash dishes, do laundry, sweep floor. 200 pesos, maybe 2 times a week." 200 pesos was about £3. Twice a week was 400 pesos, £6. It seemed reasonable, and George's apartment was indeed getting messy. "Okay," he agreed. Weena started coming in the mornings on Tuesdays and Fridays to clean. She was thorough and efficient. She'd wash dishes, do laundry, mop floors, organize shelves. George's apartment had never been so clean. He started giving her small bonuses. An extra 100 pesos here, 200 there. For doing such a good job, he'd say. Weena would protest, saying it wasn't necessary, but she'd accept with grateful smiles. George was happy. He'd found someone reliable, someone who helped make his life easier, someone who felt almost like family. He had no idea he was being groomed, that every smile, every kindness, every moment of connection was calculated, that Weena was studying him, learning his vulnerabilities, preparing to extract everything she could from this lonely old foreigner who just wanted someone to care about him. It was mid-March when Weena first called George Papa George. They were sitting in his apartment after dinner, chatting about her family. She'd shown him photos on her phone, her 8-year-old son, Angelo, her elderly mother, her younger sister who was still in school. "My son, he need father figure," Weena said sadly. His father left when he was baby. Never send money. Never visit. Angelo grow up without Papa. It makes me so sad. Where is the father now? George asked. I don't know. Manila somewhere. With another woman. He don't care about Angelo. She wiped tears from her eyes. Sorry. I am emotional about this. George felt a pang of sympathy. He'd never had children, but he understood loss and abandonment. Angelo is lucky to have you, George said. You're a good mother. Thank you, Papa George. She smiled through her tears. Papa George? He repeated, surprised. Yes, you are like Papa to me. You are kind, you listen, you care. Like father I never had. George felt something warm in his chest. He'd never been anyone's papa. Never had children of his own. Hearing Rowena say it, hearing someone call him that made him feel needed, valued. Well, I'm honored, he said, trying to sound casual but deeply moved. From that day forward, Rowena always called him Papa George. And George, despite knowing it was perhaps too familiar, too fast, couldn't bring himself to discourage it, because it felt good. To be someone's papa. To matter to someone. A few weeks later, Rowena arrived at George's apartment in tears. Real, heavy tears. She could barely speak. Rowena, what's wrong? George asked, alarmed. My son, Angelo. He is sick, very sick. I take him to hospital. They say he have dengue fever. Need to stay in hospital. Need IV treatment. Dengue fever. George had read about it, a mosquito-borne illness common in tropical countries. Dangerous if untreated. Is he going to be okay? Yes, if he get treatment. But hospital wants 5,000 pesos deposit before they start treatment. I don't have. I only have 2,000 pesos saved. I ask family. They have no money. I don't know what to do. She was sobbing. George felt his heart breaking for her. 5,000 pesos was about 78 pounds. Not a fortune. I'll help, George said immediately. How much do you need? 3,000 pesos. That is all I need for deposit. I will pay you back, Papa George. I promise. When I save money, I pay you back. Don't worry about paying me back. Just take care of Angelo. George went to his bedroom and took 3,000 pesos from the cash he kept in his drawer. He handed it to Rowena. She hugged him tightly, still crying. Thank you, Papa George. Thank you so much. You saved my son's life. She left immediately to go to the hospital. George sat in his apartment feeling good about what he'd done. He'd helped someone in need. A child's life might be saved because of him. That felt meaningful. Rowena returned the next evening with dinner and more tears, these ones happy. Angelo was responding well to treatment. He'd be in hospital for a few more days, but he was going to be okay. Because of you, Papa George, because you help us. She showed him a photo of Angelo in a hospital bed, with an IV in his arm, looking weak but smiling. George felt that same warm feeling. He'd made a real difference. Over the next few months, there were more requests. Never huge amounts, always reasonable, always urgent. Rowena's mother needed medicine for diabetes, 2,000 pesos. Her sister needed school supplies, 1,000 pesos. The electric bill was overdue, and they'd be cut off, 1,500 pesos. The roof of their house was leaking and needed repairs, 5,000 pesos. Angelo needed new shoes for school, 800 pesos. Each time, Rowena would come to George with tears or worry, explaining the situation. And each time, George would give her the money. Because what else could he do? These weren't luxury purchases. These were necessities: medicine, education, shelter, a child's shoes. George was living on his pension 50,000 pesos a month. His rent was 12,000, utilities another 3,000. Food and basic expenses maybe 15,000 more. That left him about 20,000 pesos to spare each month. But the requests were coming more frequently. And the amounts were getting larger. By June, George had given Rowena about 40,000 pesos, total roughly 630 pounds. It wasn't breaking him financially, but it was more than he'd planned to spend. He started feeling a small knot of anxiety in his stomach when Rowena would show up with that worried look on her face. But he couldn't say no. How could he say no to medicine for a sick mother? To shoes for a child? To fixing a leaking roof? And besides, Rowena always said she'd pay him back. She kept a notebook where she wrote down every amount George gave her. I pay you back, Papa George. I promise. When I have money, I pay everything back. George believed her because he wanted to believe her, because she'd become important to him, like family. And you don't abandon family when they need help. What George didn't know was that every peso he gave Rowena was part of a carefully orchestrated scam. That there was no sick son in the hospital, no diabetes medicine, no leaking roof. That Rowena was a practiced con artist who'd identified George as an easy mark, a lonely old foreigner with money and no family to watch out for him. And the worst was yet to come. The first major crisis came in July. Rowena arrived at George's apartment one evening, not with dinner, but with a panicked expression and red, swollen eyes. "Papa George, I have terrible problem. I don't know what to do." "What happened?" My younger brother, June. He had motorcycle accident. He is in ICU. Critical condition. Doctors say he needs surgery or he will die." "Oh God, Rowena, I'm so sorry. Surgery costs 200,000 pesos. Insurance don't cover. We don't have money. My family tried to borrow, but nobody have that much. If we don't pay, hospital will not do surgery. My brother will die." 200,000 pesos. George did the math quickly. About 3,100 pounds. His stomach dropped. That was a lot of money. More than he'd ever given anyone at once. "Rowena, I don't have that kind of cash on hand. That's a huge amount." "I know, Papa George, I know. I am not asking for all. Maybe you can help with some? Anything? I try to borrow from other people too, but anything you can give, it helps save my brother's life." She was crying, real tears streaming down her face. Her hands were shaking. George felt paralyzed. 3,000 pounds was a significant chunk of his savings. But this was someone's life, Rowena's brother. And he'd heard stories of people dying in Filipino hospitals because they couldn't pay. It wasn't like the UK where the NHS would treat you regardless. Here, if you couldn't pay, you didn't get treatment. "How much do you need from me?" George asked. "Whatever you can give. Even 50,000 pesos help. Even 20,000. Anything, Papa George. Please." 50,000 pesos was about 780 pounds. That seemed more manageable. Still a lot, but not impossible. "I can give you 50,000, George said. "But that's all I can do right now." Rowena hugged him, crying. "Thank you, Papa George. Thank you. You saved my brother's life. I will never forget this. I pay you back. I promise." George went to the bank the next morning and withdrew 50,000 pesos in cash. He gave it to Rowena that afternoon. She was still crying, thanking him repeatedly, saying he was an angel, saying God would bless him. A few days later, Rowena reported that June had the surgery and was recovering. She showed George a photo of a young man in a hospital bed, bandaged and connected to monitors. George felt relief. His money had genuinely saved someone's life. But 2 weeks later, there was another crisis. The hospital wanted more money for continued care. Another 30,000 pesos, about 470 pounds. "I thought the surgery would cover everything?" George said, confused. "Surgery, yes, but they need to keep him in ICU. Extra cost. And medicine is expensive. I'm trying to borrow from everyone. Can you help, Papa George? Just this one more time?" George was starting to feel uneasy, but he'd already invested 50,000 in June's recovery. What was another 30,000 to make sure the job was finished? He gave her the money. Then in August, it was her mother. She'd had a stroke and needed hospitalization. 25,000 pesos. Then Angelo needed special tutoring because he'd fallen behind in school due to his illness. 10,000 pesos. Then Rowena's house was damaged in a storm and needed repairs. 40,000 pesos. By September, George had given Rowena over 200,000 pesos, about 3,100 pounds. He was starting to tap into his savings instead of just living on his pension. His anxiety was growing. He tried to talk to Rowena about it one evening. "Rowena, I want to help, but I'm worried I'm spending too much. I need to make sure I have enough money to live on for the rest of my life." Rowena looked hurt. "You think I am taking advantage? You think I lie about my family?" "No, I write everything down. Every peso you give, I write in notebook. I will pay you back, Papa George. Every peso, I promise." "It's not about that. You are the only person who helped me. The only person who care about my family. If you stop helping, I don't know what I will do." She started crying. George immediately felt guilty. Here was a woman struggling to keep her family alive, and he was worried about money? What kind of person did that make him? "I'm sorry, Rowena. I'm not saying I won't help. I'm just saying we need to be careful. I am careful, Papa George. I only ask when is emergency. Real emergency. Not for shopping or luxury. Only for life or death. George nodded. She was right. Everything had been for medical care, education, housing, necessities. He told himself he was being selfish, that he needed to trust Rowena, that she was family. But the knot in his stomach kept growing. One thing George noticed was that Rowena always insisted on cash. Every payment, every transaction, always cash. He'd offered several times to send money directly to hospitals or schools or repair workers, but she'd always said it was easier to handle in cash. Hospital want cash, not bank transfer, she'd say. Or contractor only take cash. Or school don't have bank account, only accept cash payment. George didn't question it. The Philippines was a cash-based society. Many transactions happened in cash. It made sense. What George didn't realize was that this was by design. Cash left no paper trail, no receipts, no way to verify where the money actually went. Bank transfers could be traced. Cash disappeared. In October, George's sister Margaret called from Wales. They spoke maybe once a month. Brief conversations where she asked how he was doing, and he assured her everything was fine. "How's the Philippines treating you?" Margaret asked. "Good," George said. "Really good. Weather's lovely. People are friendly. Are you being careful with your money?" "Of course." "Why?" "I worry about you, George. I hear stories about foreigners getting scammed out there." "I'm fine, Margaret. I'm not an idiot." But after hanging up, George did some mental calculations. He'd been in the Philippines for 10 months. He'd spent about £3,000 on Rowena's emergencies, plus his regular living expenses. He'd spent about £10,000 total since arriving. That was a lot. More than he'd planned, but not catastrophic. He still had £180,000 in savings. He was fine. Except the requests kept coming. In November, Rowena came to George in absolute panic. She'd borrowed money from a loan shark to pay for June's hospital bills, and now the loan shark was demanding repayment with interest. If she didn't pay, they'd threaten to hurt her family. "How much do you owe?" George asked, already dreading the answer. 80,000 pesos. With interest, it is now 100,000 pesos. I have to pay by end of month, or they say they will hurt my mother and Angelo. 100,000 pesos. About 1,550 pounds. George felt sick. That was a massive amount. But loan sharks in the Philippines were notorious for violence. He'd heard stories. If Rowena didn't pay, her family could be in real danger. "Why did you borrow from a loan shark?" "I had no choice. June needs surgery. Hospital want money immediately. I try to borrow from bank, but they say no. I try to borrow from friends, but nobody have money. Loan shark was only option." She was crying again. "I am so stupid, Papa George. So stupid. Now I put my family in danger." George felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. If he gave her the money, he'd have spent over £6,000 in less than a year on her emergencies. That was significant, but if he didn't, her family might get hurt, possibly killed. He gave her the money, 100,000 pesos in cash, withdrawn from his savings account. Rowena cried and thanked him and promised she'd pay everything back. She showed him her notebook where she'd written down every amount. The total was now over 320,000 pesos, about £5,000. "I will pay you back, Papa George, I promise. It might take time, but I will pay every peso." George nodded. But for the first time, he didn't believe her. Not because he thought she was lying, but because he couldn't see how a street food vendor earning maybe 10,000 pesos a month could ever pay back £5,000. It would take her years. But what was done was done. He'd made his choices. Now he had to live with them. In December, Rowena brought George a Christmas gift, a simple wooden cross that she said she'd bought from a local artisan. "For Papa George, my blessing for you." George was touched. It was the first gift anyone had given him in years. He hung it on his wall. 2 days later, Rowena came to him with another emergency. Her landlord was evicting her family. They needed to pay 3 months back rent or they'd be on the street. 45,000 pesos. George gave it to her. By the end of December, George had given Rowena over 400,000 pesos, about 6,200 pounds. His savings were down to 160,000 pounds. He'd spent 30,000 pounds in 1 year. almost 20% of his retirement funds. And the worst was still to come. January brought a new crisis. Wena's house, the one George had already paid to repair twice, had a fire. Not a big fire, but enough to damage the kitchen and destroy most of their belongings. They needed money to rebuild and replace everything. How much? George asked, his voice flat. 150,000 pesos. For repairs and to buy new things. Clothes, furniture, kitchen equipment. Everything burned, Papa George. Everything. 150,000 pesos. About 2,300 pounds. George sat in silence. He'd been feeling increasingly uneasy about the constant emergencies. They never seemed to stop. Every time he helped with one crisis, another appeared immediately after. "Wena, I need to see the house," George said. "I want to see the damage." Wena looked surprised. "Why? You don't trust me?" "It's not about trust. I want to see. I've given you so much money. I just want to see where it's going." She looked hurt. "You think I lie? You think I make up story about fire? No, I just want to see. You never want to see before. Never asked to visit my house. Never asked to meet my family. Now, suddenly, you want to see? Why?" George felt guilty. She was right. He'd never asked to visit, never asked for proof. He just trusted her. But he was starting to have doubts, real doubts. "I just want to understand," George said. Wena stood up, tears in her eyes. "You know what, Papa George? I think maybe I bother you too much. Maybe I should stop asking for help. Maybe I should manage by myself." "Wena, wait. No. Is okay. I understand. I am burden. I ask too much. You are right to say no." She left the apartment. George sat there feeling terrible. Had he been unfair? Was he being paranoid? Wena had been nothing but kind to him. She'd cooked for him, cleaned for him, kept him company. Why was he suddenly doubting her? The next day, George went to the bank to withdraw 150,000 pesos for Wena's house repairs. But when the teller checked his account, she looked confused. "Sir, your account has very low balance." "What?" "No, I should have about 170,000 pounds. The teller showed him the screen. His account had only 40,000 pounds left. George felt the room spin. "That's impossible. There must be a mistake. Let me check the transaction history." The teller pulled up his account history. Over the past 3 months, there had been multiple large withdrawals. 30,000 pounds in September, 40,000 pounds in October, 35,000 pounds in November, 25,000 pounds in December. "I didn't make these withdrawals," George said, his voice shaking. "They were cash withdrawals, sir. Made at various branches in Manila." George's mind raced. He'd given Wena his ATM card months ago so she could withdraw small amounts to buy groceries for him. He'd given her his PIN. She'd said it was more convenient than him having to give her cash every time. Had she been making unauthorized withdrawals? George left the bank in a daze. He went home and looked for his ATM card. It wasn't in his wallet. He checked his drawers. Not there. He checked everywhere. The card was gone. When Wena came that evening to deliver dinner, George confronted her. "Where's my ATM card?" She looked surprised. "What?" "My bank card. I gave it to you to buy groceries." "Where is it?" "I give it back to you. Last month. You don't remember?" "No, you didn't. And there have been large withdrawals from my account." "Did you take money?" Wena's face changed. The usual warmth was gone. In its place was something cold, hard. "You think I steal from you? I don't know what to think. My money is gone. And you have my card. I don't have your card. I give it back. Maybe you lose it. Maybe you forget. You are old man. Maybe your memory is not good." George felt anger rising. "My memory is fine. Someone has been taking money from my account. Large amounts. Maybe other people steal. Maybe someone hacked your account. Why you blame me? After everything I do for you? Because you're the only one who had access." Wena stood up, her face twisted in fury. "You know what, Papa George? I think you need to think carefully. You think money is more important than love? More important than family? I take care of you for 1 year. I cook for you, clean for you, make you happy. And this is how you thank me? By accusing me? I'm not accusing. I'm asking, you are accusing. And I don't need this. I have my own problems. My family have real problems. Not rich foreigner problems. Real problems. And I waste my time helping you? She grabbed her bag and headed for the door. Weena, wait. Goodbye, Papa George. I hope your money make you happy. Because you lose me, you lose your family. She slammed the door. George stood in his empty apartment, his heart pounding. What had just happened? Had he been wrong to confront her? Or had she just shown her true self? He called the bank again and requested they freeze his account and issue a new card with a new PIN. They said it would take 7 days. That night, George couldn't sleep. He kept replaying every interaction with Weena, every request for money, every tear, every story. Had it all been fake? Had she been scamming him from the beginning? The next morning, George went to his drawer, where he kept cash for emergencies. He'd had about 30,000 pesos there, about 460 pounds. It was gone. He checked the drawer where he kept his passport. Also gone. His laptop gone. His phone gone. Everything of value that could be easily carried, gone. George sank onto his couch, realizing what had happened. Weena hadn't just taken his money. She'd cleaned him out, and then disappeared. George went to the police the next day to file a report. The police station was crowded and chaotic. He waited for hours before finally speaking to an officer who took his statement with visible disinterest. You gave her your ATM card and PIN? The officer asked. Yes, but... And you gave her cash money many times? Yes, but she said it was for emergencies. Sir, if you gave her willingly, is not theft, is your choice. But she stole my passport. That's illegal. We will make report. We will try to find her. But I must be honest. Probably we cannot help. She is gone now. And you have no proof she took anything. You say she came to your apartment. You gave her key? No, but I might have left the door unlocked. Then anyone could enter. Could be robbers. Could be many people. Cannot prove was her. George left the police station feeling hopeless. They weren't going to help. Weena was gone. His money was gone. His passport was gone. He contacted the British Embassy in Manila. They told him he'd need to apply for an emergency travel document, which would take 2 to 3 weeks and cost about 5,000 pesos. They asked if he had proof of identity. He had his driver's license from the UK, which would have to do. But George had a bigger problem. His visa had expired. He'd meant to renew it, but had been too distracted with Weena's emergencies. Now he was an overstayer. If immigration caught him, he'd be arrested, fined, detained, and deported. He couldn't afford the visa penalty fees. He couldn't afford much of anything. His bank account had 40,000 pounds left, but it was frozen while they investigated the unauthorized withdrawals. He had no ATM card, no phone, no laptop, no way to access anything. He had about 5,000 pesos in coins and small bills scattered around his apartment, about 77 pounds. In mid-January, George missed his rent payment. Mrs. Santos, his landlady, came knocking. Mr. George, rent is late. You must pay now, or I must ask you to leave. I'll have it soon, George said. Just a few more days. I'm waiting for my bank to sort something out. You have 1 week. If no payment, you must go. George tried to contact his sister Margaret in Wales, but he had no phone. He tried to use a computer at an internet cafe, but his email password wasn't working. Rowena must have changed it when she took his laptop. He was completely cut off. 1 week later, Mrs. Santos returned with 2 men. Mr. George, you must leave. Now, I keep your deposit for unpaid rent. Your things will stay here until you pay what you owe. But I have nowhere to go. Not my problem. You leave now, or I call police. George packed a small bag with clothes and the few items Mrs. Santos allowed him to take. He walked out of the apartment with everything he owned on his back. He was homeless, 69 years old, in a foreign country, with no money, no passport, no phone, and an expired visa that made him a criminal. George spent his first night sleeping on a bench in Rizal Park. The heat was oppressive. Mosquitoes bit him constantly. He barely slept. Over the next few days, he wandered Manila, trying to figure out what to do. He had about 4,000 pesos left. He ate cheap street food, 10 pesos for a small portion of rice and fish. He drank water from public fountains. He avoided police. He tried to go to the British Embassy again, but security wouldn't let him in without an appointment, which required a working phone number or email. He had neither. After a week on the streets, a Filipino man named Ronaldo, who sold cigarettes near Manila Bay, noticed George sleeping rough and offered him some food. "You are homeless?" Ronaldo asked in broken English. "Yes," George admitted. "Why?" "You are foreigner. You have money." "I did. Not anymore." Ronaldo shared his dinner with George rice and dried fish. He showed George where it was safer to sleep under the overhang of a closed shop on Roxas Boulevard where other homeless people gathered. He warned him about police sweeps that happened at random times. Police don't like foreigners sleeping in street. They ask for papers. If you have no papers, they arrest you. Better you hide when you see police. George became part of the homeless community along Manila Bay. There were dozens of them, Filipino men mostly, some missing limbs or teeth, some mentally ill, all surviving on scraps and charity. They shared food when they had it. They watched out for each other. George's health began to deteriorate. He lost weight rapidly. The heat and humidity were brutal. He developed heat rash and dehydration. He had constant diarrhea from the street food. His feet were covered in sores from walking all day in worn-out shoes. He tried begging, sitting with a cardboard sign that said, "Please help, British citizen, lost everything." Filipino people mostly walked past. Other foreigners sometimes gave him 20 or 50 pesos. Other expats would sometimes stop and talk, shocked to see a British man in this condition. One expat, an Australian named Barry, gave George 200 pesos and said, "Mate, how did you end up like this?" George told him a short version of the story. Barry shook his head. "You got scammed. Happens a lot out here. You need to get to your embassy. They can help." "I've tried. I can't get in without an appointment." "Keep trying, mate. It's your only chance." George survived February on the streets, then March. 2 months, sleeping rough. 2 months of hunger, heat, fear, and humiliation. One day in early April, a local priest named Father Ricardo approached George near the seawall. "I have seen you here many times," Father Ricardo said in good English. "You are in trouble. You need help." "I've lost everything," George said, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "Come with me. Our church has a program for people in crisis. We can help you." Father Ricardo took George to Street Lorenzo Ruiz Church in Binondo. The church ran a small shelter with beds and meals for homeless people. They also had a social worker who helped people navigate government services. The social worker, a kind Filipino woman named Susan, listened to George's story. She helped him file a proper report with the British Embassy. Using the church's phone and computer, she helped him fill out the forms for an emergency travel document. "This will take some time," Susan said. "Maybe 3 or 4 weeks, maybe longer. But you can stay here at the shelter until everything is arranged." The shelter was basic bunk beds in a large room, shared bathrooms, simple meals of rice and vegetables. But it was safe, clean, air-conditioned. After 2 months on the streets, it felt like luxury. In early May, George's emergency travel document came through. The British Embassy arranged for emergency repatriation. They would loan him the cost of a flight home, which he'd have to repay once he was back in the UK. On May 12th, George boarded a flight from Manila to London. He left the Philippines with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter memory of how paradise had turned into hell. The flight was long and uncomfortable. George was weak, malnourished, his body aching from months of sleeping rough. He'd lost about 3 stone 42 pounds, most of it muscle. His face was gaunt. His clothes hung off him. He looked 20 years older than when he'd left Bristol. When the plane landed at Heathrow, George felt a strange mixture of relief and shame. He was home. He was safe. But he was returning in complete failure. Margaret met him at the airport. When she saw him, she gasped. "George, my God, what happened to you?" "I made some mistakes," George said quietly. She took him to her house in Wales. She'd set up the spare room for him. She fed him proper meals. She took him to a doctor who diagnosed dehydration, malnutrition, and various infections from his time on the streets. Over the next few weeks, George slowly recovered physically, but emotionally, he was broken. He'd lost 150,000 pounds, almost 80% of his life savings. All of it gone to a woman who'd pretended to care about him, who'd called him Papa George, while systematically draining him dry. Margaret helped him apply for universal credit and housing assistance. Because George had spent his savings, he qualified for benefits. The government set him up in a small council flat in Bristol, a one-bedroom place in a tower block in Easton, ironically not far from where he'd lived before leaving for the Philippines. The flat was small and depressing. Gray walls, old carpet, a view of the car park. But it was free, and it was home. George's pension of £800 a month barely covered his expenses. Food, utilities, transportation. He had almost nothing left over. No savings, no buffer. Just a monthly check and government benefits. He spent his days alone in the flat, watching television, reliving his mistakes. He'd wake up at night from dreams of Manila, the heat, the street noise, Wena's voice calling him Papa George. The shame was overwhelming. How could he have been so stupid? Everyone had warned him. His sister, other expats, common sense. But he'd ignored it all because he was lonely, because he wanted to be needed. He tried to file a police report in the UK about Rowena, but they said it was a matter for Philippine authorities. The Philippine police never followed up on his initial report. Rowena was gone, probably working on the next victim. 6 months after returning, George joined a support group for victims of romance scams. He discovered he wasn't alone. There were dozens of others, men who'd lost money to women in Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, Colombia, different countries, different stories, but the same pattern. Lonely men, younger women, emotional manipulation, fake emergencies, money disappearing, then the women vanishing. George started sharing his story in the group, warning others, trying to make sense of what had happened to him. "I thought I was helping her survive," George said at one meeting. "I didn't know she'd already planned how to take my life apart." The group facilitator said, "These women are professionals. They're trained either formally or through experience to identify vulnerable targets and exploit them systematically. You're not stupid for falling for it. You're human. You wanted connection. You wanted to matter to someone. That's not a weakness. That's just being human." But George couldn't forgive himself. He'd thrown away everything he'd worked 47 years to save. For what? For a woman who'd never cared about him. For a fantasy he'd created in his own mind. George Whitman is now 70 years old. He lives in a small council flat in Bristol, surviving on his pension and government benefits. His monthly income is about £1,200, $800 from his pension, and $400 in benefits. After rent, utilities, and basic expenses, he has almost nothing left. He will never retire comfortably. He will never travel again. He will never recover the £150,000 he lost. He'll live in that council flat until he dies, probably alone, probably in poverty. But he's alive, he survived, and he's trying to make his suffering mean something. George volunteers at a local senior center where he runs a monthly workshop on scam prevention. He shares his story in full, without shame, to help others avoid his mistakes. "I thought I was helping her survive," George tells his audiences. "I thought I was being kind. I thought I was family. I didn't know she'd already planned how to take my life apart." He's learned things about himself through this experience. That loneliness makes you vulnerable in ways nothing else does. That the need to be needed can override every warning sign. That kindness without boundaries is dangerous. The worst part wasn't losing the money, George says. It was realizing that everything I believed about her was a lie. Every smile, every tear, every time she called me Papa George. All of it was calculated. All of it was designed to extract as much money as possible before disappearing. When asked what advice he'd give to others considering retirement abroad, George's response is clear. If someone needs constant financial help, they're not family, they're a liability. Real relationships don't require constant cash payments. Real care doesn't come with an invoice. And if you find yourself giving money to someone you barely know, stop, walk away. Because loneliness is expensive, but it's cheaper than what I paid. George knows there are other victims. He's connected with dozens through support groups. Men who lost their savings to women in the Philippines. Some, like George, survived and went home broke. Others never made it home. George heard about one British man who committed suicide on the streets of Manila after losing everything. Another who died from heat exhaustion while sleeping rough. The casualties of romance scams aren't just financial. They're human. Rowena is still out there, as far as George knows. He's heard from other expats that she was seen in Ermita, working her cart, looking for new victims. The police never arrested her. Probably never will. She hasn't technically broken any laws. George gave her money willingly. She never forced him. She just manipulated him expertly. George wonders sometimes how many victims Rowena has had, how many lonely foreign men she's destroyed, how much money she's stolen. Hundreds of thousands? Millions? How does someone live with that? How does someone look in the mirror knowing they've ruined lives? But then George realizes Rowena probably doesn't think of herself as a villain. She probably justifies it. They're rich foreigners. They can afford it. I'm just surviving, taking care of my family. She probably sleeps fine at night. And maybe that's the hardest part, knowing that the person who destroyed your life doesn't care, doesn't even think about you, has moved on to the next victim without a backward glance. But George has learned to let go of that anger. Holding on to it was destroying him. Now he focuses on what he can control, his volunteer work, his story, his warnings to others. Is it the life he imagined? No. He thought he'd spend his retirement on beaches, happy, at peace. Instead, he's in a council flat in Bristol, living on benefits, warning others about the mistakes he made. But he's alive. He survived. And, in its own way, that's enough. I thought I was helping her survive. I didn't know she'd already planned how to take my life apart, George says. That's what I want people to understand. These scammers don't just take your money. They study you. They learn your vulnerabilities. They craft stories specifically designed to exploit your kindness. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. That's what keeps George Whitman going. Not hope for a better future, not dreams of recovery, just the knowledge that his suffering might save someone else from the same fate. And if his story stops even one lonely man from making the same mistakes, then maybe, just maybe, losing everything wasn't completely pointless. He wakes up from dreams of Manila still hearing the street noise, still remembering how quickly paradise turned into hell, still seeing Rowena's smile and hearing her voice calling him Papa George. But now he knows the truth. It was never real. None of it was real. And that knowledge, painful as it is what finally set him free.